In the autumn of 1879, something happened inside Ravens Hollow Baptist Church that defied all explanation. Every Sunday morning, at precisely 11:15, members of the congregation would begin collapsing without warning. Their faces would turn pale, their breathing would become labored, and within moments they would crumple to the wooden floor as if struck by an invisible force. The strangest part? No one could hear what was causing it. But before we dive deeper into this disturbing mystery that shook a small Kentucky community to its core, I want to ask you to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button if you enjoy these dark historical mysteries. Also, let me know in the comments what city and country you're listening from. I love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts from around the world. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. Now let's return to the haunting events that would forever change the faithful of Ravens Hollow, because what they discovered beneath their place of worship would shake their faith to its very foundation. According to the fragmented accounts passed down through local families and scattered church records, the mystery that plagued this small Kentucky congregation may have had roots far deeper and darker than anyone could have imagined. Ravens Hollow was a modest coal mining community nestled in the rolling hills of eastern Kentucky, where the morning mist clung to the valleys like ghostly fingers. The town consisted of no more than 300 souls, most of whom made their living from the black veins of coal that ran beneath the earth. It was a place where Methodist and Baptist churches stood on opposite sides of the main dirt road, and where a man's word was still considered his bond. The Ravens Hollow Baptist Church had been erected in the spring of 1878, a modest wooden structure with white-painted walls and a simple bell tower that could be heard for miles across the Kentucky countryside. The church sat atop a gentle rise overlooking the town, its position chosen by Pastor Jeremiah Raven himself, who had arrived from Louisville with ambitious plans to build the largest congregation in the county. Pastor Raven was a tall, gaunt man with penetrating grey eyes and prematurely silver hair that he kept slicked back with pomade. At 42 years of age, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that could hold a congregation spellbound for hours. His sermons were legendary throughout the region, drawing visitors from neighboring communities who came to hear his passionate interpretations of Scripture. He spoke of salvation with the fervor of a man who had seen both heaven and hell, and his voice carried an authority that few dared to question. The church's interior was simple but dignified, with hand-carved wooden pews that could seat nearly 200 people. The altar was constructed from local limestone, quarried from the hills surrounding the community, and topped with a simple wooden cross that Pastor Raven had crafted with his own hands. Tall windows lined both sides of the sanctuary, allowing the Kentucky sunlight to stream across the worn wooden floors during morning services. The congregation consisted primarily of mining families who had lived in the area for generations, along with newer arrivals drawn by the promise of steady work in the expanding coal industry. These were hard-working people who rose before dawn, spent their days in the darkness underground, and gathered each Sunday to sing hymns and listen to Pastor Raven's powerful sermons about redemption and eternal life. The first incident occurred on a crisp October morning in 1879, just as Pastor Raven was reaching the climax of his sermon about the Valley of Dry Bones. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, a 57-year-old widow who sat in the third pew every Sunday without fail, suddenly placed her hand to her chest and began breathing heavily. Her face drained of all color, and before anyone could react, she collapsed onto the wooden floor with a dull thud that echoed through the sanctuary. At first, the congregation assumed she had suffered from the heat, or perhaps had eaten something that disagreed with her. Several men carried her outside into the cool morning air, where she gradually regained consciousness, claiming she felt perfectly fine, but strangely exhausted. Pastor Raven continued his service, though the incident cast a shadow over the remainder of the morning. The following Sunday, It happened again. This time, it was Thomas Mackenzie, a robust coal miner in his 30s who had never shown signs of ill health. He was sitting in the back row when his breathing became labored, his face turned ashen, and he slumped forward onto the pew in front of him, like Mrs. Whitfield. He recovered completely once he was taken outside, with no memory of what had caused his collapse. By the third occurrence, a pattern began to emerge that filled the congregation with unease. Every Sunday, at almost exactly the same time during the service, someone would fall ill. The timing was so precise that some members began checking their pocket watches, noting that the collapses invariably began around 11:15 in the morning, just as Pastor Raven's voice would rise to its most passionate intensity. What made the phenomenon even more disturbing was that the victims described similar sensations before losing consciousness. They spoke of feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something terrible was about to happen. Many reported hearing what they described as a high-pitched whining sound, though others in the congregation claimed they heard nothing unusual at all. Dr. Harrison Blackwood, the town's only physician, was summoned to examine the afflicted individuals. A stern man in his 60s who had served as a field surgeon during the war between the states, Dr. Blackwood found no physical ailments that could explain the mysterious collapses. The victims' hearts were strong, their lungs clear, and their overall health appeared excellent. As word of the strange occurrences spread throughout the community, the church began to empty. Families who had never missed a Sunday service started attending the Methodist church across town, while others simply stayed home rather than risk whatever malevolent force seemed to plague Raven's Hollow Baptist Church. Pastor Raven watched his congregation dwindle from nearly 200 members to fewer than 50 within a matter of weeks. The pastor himself seemed deeply troubled by the events, though he insisted they continue holding services as scheduled. During his sermons, he began speaking more frequently about spiritual warfare and the devil's attempts to undermine the faithful. His once commanding presence seemed diminished, and those who remained noticed that his hands trembled slightly when he gripped the pulpit. Old-timers in the community began sharing stories they had heard from their fathers and grandfathers about the land where the church now stood. The area had once been the site of a coal mining operation owned by a man named Cornelius Blackstone, a wealthy industrialist from Lexington who had purchased extensive mineral rights throughout eastern Kentucky in the years following the Civil War. According to these half-remembered tales, Blackstone had imported workers from various parts of the country and beyond to work his mines, including a large group of Chinese laborers who had been recruited after completing work on the Transcontinental Railroad in California. These men were known for their skill and dedication, working longer hours than their American counterparts for significantly lower wages. Martha Henderson, whose late husband had worked for Blackstone in the early 1870s, recalled conversations about how the Chinese workers had been housed in a separate camp away from the main mining settlement. They kept to themselves, she remembered, speaking their own language and following customs that the local residents found strange and unsettling. The most disturbing story came from Samuel Garrett, an elderly man whose father had been one of Blackstone's foremen. According to Samuel, there had been a terrible accident at the mine in the winter of 1873. A section of the tunnels had collapsed during a particularly harsh February storm, trapping dozens of workers underground. The rescue efforts had been called off after only 2 days, with Blackstone claiming that further digging would be too dangerous and expensive. Pastor Raven's behavior became increasingly erratic as the mysterious collapses continued. Congregation members noticed that he would often stare intently at the altar during services, as if listening for something only he could hear. His sermons took on darker themes, focusing obsessively on guilt, redemption, and the weight of hidden sins. Mary Catherine Walsh, the church organist, was among the first to notice something peculiar about the altar itself. During her practice sessions on weekday evenings, She reported hearing strange sounds emanating from beneath the limestone structure. She described it as a subtle vibration, almost like the distant rumble of underground thunder, that seemed to grow stronger as the weeks passed. Intrigued by Mary Catherine's observations, several church members decided to investigate the altar more closely. What they discovered was deeply unsettling. Tiny cracks had begun to appear in the limestone base, creating hairline fissures that seemed to pulse with an almost imperceptible rhythm. When they placed their ears close to these cracks, they could hear what sounded like air escaping under pressure, accompanied by the faintest whisper of movement far below. The investigation took a more serious turn when James Morrison, a mining engineer who attended services with his wife, offered to examine the church's foundation. Morrison had considerable experience with underground structures and immediately recognized signs that the building had been constructed over unstable ground. Using surveying equipment borrowed from the mining company, Morrison discovered that the church sat directly above what appeared to be a network of abandoned mine shafts. The limestone altar had been positioned at the exact center of what had once been the main entrance to the underground workings. More troubling still, his measurements indicated that the old mine extended far deeper than any of the currently active operations in the area. Armed with this information, Morrison began researching the history of the land in the county courthouse records. What he found confirmed the community's worst fears about Cornelius Blackstone's mining operation. The official records showed that Blackstone had filed extensive claims in the area during 1872 and 1873, but had abruptly ceased all operations in February 1874, selling the land to the church for an unusually low price. The breakthrough came when Morrison discovered a cache of correspondence between Blackstone and various government officials in the basement of the county courthouse. Hidden among routine business documents was a series of increasingly desperate letters that painted a disturbing picture of the final months of the mining operation. In a letter dated January 15, 1874, Blackstone wrote to a business associate in Louisville about mounting financial pressures and his inability to pay the wages owed to his workers. The Chinese laborers, in particular, had become increasingly demanding about their overdue compensation, threatening to leave en masse if their pay was not delivered immediately. A subsequent letter, dated February 3, 1874, revealed Blackstone's solution to his financial crisis. He had decided to stage a mining accident that would eliminate his debt to the Chinese workers while providing him with insurance money to cover his losses. The plan was to collapse a section of the mine where the Chinese workers were housed during their rest periods, making it appear as though they had been caught in a natural cave-in. The final letter in the series, written to Pastor Raven's predecessor, Reverend Marcus Thorne, was the most damning of all. Dated February 28, 1874, it contained explicit instructions for Thorne to remain silent about the true nature of the mining accident in exchange for a generous donation to build a new church on the site. Blackstone had calculated that constructing a house of worship over the sealed mine would discourage any future investigation into what lay beneath. When Morrison shared these discoveries with Pastor Raven, the minister's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face went completely white, and his hands began shaking so violently that he could barely hold the documents. After reading the letters in silence, he locked them away in his desk and forbade Morrison from discussing their contents with anyone else in the congregation. But Morrison had seen enough to understand the full horror of what had happened. The Chinese workers hadn't died in an accident. They had been murdered, buried alive in the mine shaft when Blackstone ordered the explosives detonated. The church had been built as both a monument to and a cover-up of one of the most heinous crimes in Kentucky's history. That night, Morrison couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the strange sounds Mary Catherine had heard coming from beneath the altar and the mysterious force that was causing congregation members to collapse during services. What if the gases that were escaping through the cracks in the limestone weren't just harmless air, but something far more sinister? The truth about the silent cry from Raven's Hollow Church finally emerged during what would become the congregation's final service. On a cold November morning, as Pastor Raven stood at the altar delivering a sermon about divine justice, the limestone base began to crack more visibly, releasing a stronger flow of gas that created an audible hissing sound. Morrison, who had been monitoring the situation from the back pew, immediately recognized the danger. The gases escaping from the sealed mine were not just causing the mysterious collapses. They were toxic fumes that had been building pressure underground for nearly 6 years. The decomposition of the bodies trapped in the mine, combined with the natural chemical processes occurring in the abandoned coal seams, had created a lethal cocktail of methane and hydrogen sulfide. As the congregation began to show signs of distress, Morrison shouted for everyone to evacuate immediately. But Pastor Raven remained at the altar, seemingly transfixed by the growing cracks in the limestone. When Morrison reached him, the pastor was weeping uncontrollably, clutching the letters that revealed Blackstone's conspiracy. "I knew," Pastor Raven whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing hiss of escaping gas. "I've known since the day I arrived here. Blackstone didn't just pay my predecessor to stay quiet. He paid me too. Every month, money would arrive with instructions to maintain the silence. I told myself I was doing God's work, building a congregation, saving souls. But I was just another part of his cover-up." The pastor's confession revealed the final piece of the puzzle. The silent cry that had been affecting the congregation wasn't just the result of toxic gases. It was occurring at frequencies that were inaudible to most human ears but could still affect the nervous system. The victims weren't hearing the sound with their ears. They were feeling it in their bones, their blood, their very souls. The gases were carrying more than just chemical toxins. They were carrying the final screams of 47 Chinese workers who had died in the darkness below, their voices preserved in the mineral-rich atmosphere of the sealed mine and released gradually as the limestone altar began to deteriorate. As Morrison helped Pastor Raven toward the exit, the minister made one final confession. He had been experiencing the effects of the toxic gases for months, but his guilt over his complicity in the cover-up had convinced him that his suffering was divine punishment. He had welcomed the mysterious illness, seeing it as God's way of making him pay for his sins. The evacuation of Raven's Hollow Baptist Church marked the end of one of Kentucky's most disturbing secrets. Within days of Morrison's discovery, federal marshals arrived to investigate the scene, bringing with them mining experts and scientists who confirmed the presence of human remains in the sealed mine shaft beneath the altar. The excavation that followed revealed the full extent of Blackstone's crime. 47 bodies were recovered from the collapsed mine, all showing evidence of having been alive when the explosion occurred. Personal belongings found with the remains helped identify many of the victims, most of whom had families in California who had never learned what became of their loved ones. Pastor Jeremiah Raven submitted his resignation and left Kentucky permanently, never to return to the ministry. Before his departure, he used his own savings to erect a memorial stone listing the names of the 47 Chinese workers who had died in the mine. The stone still stands today in the small cemetery behind where the church once stood. Cornelius Blackstone was never brought to justice for his crimes. By the time the investigation began, he had been dead for 2 years, having died peacefully in his mansion in Lexington, his reputation intact and his wealth passed on to his children. The insurance money he had collected from the staged mining accident had funded a comfortable retirement and several other successful business ventures. The church building itself was demolished in the spring of 1880, its wooden frame and stone altar removed to prevent any further exposure to the toxic gases below. The mine shaft was properly sealed using modern techniques, ensuring that the voices of the dead would finally be silenced. But Morrison's investigation had revealed more than just a single crime. It had exposed a pattern of exploitation and abuse that was endemic throughout the coal mining industry. His detailed report became the basis for new federal regulations governing mine safety and worker protection, though meaningful change would take decades to implement. The story of Ravens Hollow serves as a reminder that some secrets are too terrible to remain buried forever. The silent cry that plagued the church was more than just a physical phenomenon. It was the voice of injustice demanding to be heard, the sound of truth refusing to remain hidden beneath layers of stone and deception. For the families of the 47 Chinese workers who died in that Kentucky mine, the discovery of their loved ones' remains brought a measure of closure to a tragedy that had haunted them for nearly 7 years. Their voices, literally preserved in the gases that escaped through the altar's limestone cracks, had finally found a way to tell their story. What do you think about this dark chapter in American history? Do you believe justice was ultimately served, even though it came too late for the victims? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story as haunting as I did, please subscribe to our channel, activate the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the darker mysteries of our past. Until next time, remember that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply we try to bury it.